It's a little tricky today because today is kind of like is a carry-on from what I've been doing the last 2 weeks. And it still means we can have this conversation, but there's going to probably be some things you're going to be wondering that may have been answered in the first week or the second week. It's a really big subject that we're looking at. It's basically, specifically as Christians, are we called to nonviolence? We know Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers. I don't think he was talking about heaven. I think he was talking about being a peacemaker on earth. So, looking at blessed are the peacemakers, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to be talking about things that, unless you've really read extensively, done research, whatever, may be outside your remit. You never heard any of this stuff before. We're just going to go for it. Today I'm going to start with the 4 primary positions in progression. I said last week, and I guess I'll start it off again today, by saying the early church. When I say early church, I'm talking about the first 300 years. The early church never picked up arms. They never went to war. That was something that they had practiced. You couldn't get them to go to war. They took it very seriously, Jesus saying, love your enemies, and that was their remit. And they couldn't really rectify killing somebody and calling that love in any way. So it said last week that the early church never took up arms. It wasn't an acceptance of, love your enemies was not acceptance of what they do. We're not loving what people do, but we're loving the person kind of thing. We love the people. So the early church practiced what Jesus preached, which we're going to look at today. They were able to resist nonviolently. I'll let that sink in a minute. So we're not talking about like this, oh yeah, everything is okay. No, everything is not okay. They would resist nonviolently. That was something that they believed in and practiced, that Jesus had showed them, proved to them, the whole thing. Apparently there's a movie out right now, Hacksaw Ridge. Has anybody seen that? And it's a true story about a guy called Desmond Doss in World War II who went to war but refused to pick up a weapon. And he spent all his time in war saving people who got wounded. He would drag them off to the medic or whatever. So in other words, he went to war, but he would not pick up an arm. So it wasn't saying he was for the war. I haven't seen the movie or read the book or anything like that. I just find it fascinating that the first thing that we're going to talk about, the early church's position was pacifism. And pacifism doesn't mean you let people kick you in the teeth and all. That's not what we're talking about. That's not what pacifism really is. It's nonviolent resistance. Ghandi, great quote here. First they ignore you, then they ridicule you, then they fight you, then you win. Isn't that a great line? Wow. He also said, be the change that you wish to see in the world. Things I'm going to be sharing, you're going to hear and you're going to go, that's like impossible. And that's why it is what it is. Because we approach things in a way that says that could never change, and that's a lie. And we know who the father of lies is. That's a lie. Things can change, but they're not going to change if we don't change them. Be the change, like Gandhi said. And if you know the story of Gandhi, what he did. He was a pacifist. He resisted what was going on in his generation, but in the form of peace rallies where he sat, fasting, a variety of different things that he believed in order to see change come. He literally changed the world in terms of the map of the world. Martin Luther King, I love this statement. He says, darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. During Jesus' day, there were various positions. I'm saying the early church, their position was pacifism, which is a nonviolent resistance. There were a lot of positions. You've probably heard the word zealot thrown around. Judas Iscariot was a zealot, and there were a lot of zealots. Supposedly Barabbas was a zealot, and they were all for war and fighting. That's how you deal with the Romans. You fight them, you kill them. That was their approach. They were zealots. There was the exact opposite as well, which is what King Herod kind of epitomized, which was just do whatever they want. Complete acceptance, complete submission to Rome. Now Herod could say that because he had so much to gain. But rich people and poor people both just threw in the towel. They just threw in the towel during their generation. Jesus did not throw towels in. He was very much into understanding what nonviolence was about. You would be hard-pressed to look at Jesus and see a violent person. You'd also be hard-pressed to see him as one who accepted anything. Everything's okay, no problem. There were problems. And his call to all of us is to resist these problems, but you accept the person and you love the person. So Paul, who's Jesus' day, the early church, pacifism, what's he write in Romans 12:14?
Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse.
That sounds a bit like, Jesus in Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount, about blessing people who curse you, pray for those who use you, love your enemies, the whole thing. Paul was down the line with that. He was in no way compromising the message of Jesus. That's Romans 12:14. Would you drop to verses 17 through 21?
Repay no one evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath, for it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap coals of fire on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good.
Paul is definitely a peace advocate. If you look at his life, the amount of times he was beat up and everything else, we never see him raising a fist or encouraging anybody to take issue with anybody under any circumstance. He began all of his letters with peace and grace. All of his letters, when you read all of his salutations to Romans, 1 Corinthians, he always is talking about grace and peace. Grace and peace be unto you. Which is a nice way of saying, be gracious to people. You've got the spirit of grace in you. And maintain peace. Blessed are the peacemakers. Be a peacemaker. That's an identification that you're a son of God kind of thing, that you've grown up. That's what a son is. It's one who's grown up. He's not a baby anymore. Well, he hit me, so I'm going to... It doesn't work anymore. The eye for the eye, tooth for the tooth is not where Jesus is coming from. He put that down and said that was okay there. It's not okay now. But he's talking about a group of people, Christians, that are living at a time of war. And this is what he says in Revelation 13:10. This is John's revelation.
Anyone is destined for captivity, to captivity he goes.
That means that if somebody comes along and invades and they take you away captive, they take you away captive. That is not, if they come and try to take you captive, make sure you got a gun so you can blow their brains out, because you're not going into captivity. He's saying the exact opposite. If that situation presents itself, then you're going into captivity. Next line.
If anyone kills with the sword he must be killed.
Hold on to that thought. What does that mean? It means exactly what it says, doesn't it? You can put any weapon you want in place of the sword. They're using sword because they didn't have guns or any other forms of weaponry, so to speak. And he basically says, if this is what you do, this is what will happen to you. If you lop off somebody's head, don't be surprised when you get your own head lopped off. But that is even to the side. Then what does he say, Russ?
Here is the perseverance and the faith of the saints.
Do you know how much faith it takes to receive that? I don't know, I should put it that way. I know for Steve Cerone how much faith it takes for me to receive that. It takes a lot of faith. It takes a lot of perseverance. I mean, if the saints were being called to fight, there's no reference there to fighting and saying you have to go forward and fight. He's saying quite the opposite. To maintain a nonviolent position requires a very serious measure of perseverance, because our instincts is the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Somebody gives you a hard time, you give them a hard time. They come to your door, they're going to take you captive. Beans on that, I ain't going no captive. He's saying the exact opposite. This thing called being a Christian, when it comes to war, what we embrace nowadays is very different than what the Bible, for the most cases, teaches. We'll talk about it. It doesn't, pacifism, I just want to say, the early church, for the first few hundred years, they were pacifists, nonviolent resistance. I said last week, so if I want to know what Jesus really taught and how he really lived, I'm going to look to the early church. I'm not going to look to the Reformation. Why would I look to a group of people 1,500 years after the fact? I want to look at the people that walked with them and talked with them, and what happened as they're being led away to the arenas and everything else. Why the heck are they doing that? Why aren't they fighting? It was quite obvious why they weren't fighting, because you don't. It would have been outside their remit, totally foreign. It's not the kingdom of God. Remember where we started with this. If my kingdom was of this world, its nature would be to fight. That's what people in this world do. That's the kingdom they live in. But that's not the kingdom of God. It's not of here. That's not his value system. It's not its nature. It's not its method. It's not any of that. It's the kingdom of God. It's an entirely different thing, which Jesus taught us by his life and by his actual teaching. But let's move on, because obviously that is not a position that is embraced today. And what I'm going through here, I don't know if you caught, I said the progression, 4 primary positions and progression. I'm not going to say evolution, because then we think in terms of, well, it's basically evolved. As the church has evolved, our principles and teachings, and it had to evolve. And this thing about war and violence has gone through a progression. I'm not going to get to the point that says it's ungodly, but I believe it is.